Hi, I'm Noel, a solo game developer working on an adventure game set across two interconnected worlds. In one, you play as a child, collecting toys and setting them up in your home, and in the other, you step into the world of imagination, where those toys come to life and the child's choices shape the world around them. For the second month of development, I decided to shift my focus away from mechanics and take on something that's always been a challenge for me: art. Specifically, I wanted to explore the visual style of the imagined world, as it is the more stylized half of the game, and see if I could start building something cohesive and expressive without relying too much on external assets. For this challenge, I gave myself a goal: build a complete in-game scene using mostly assets that I created myself. And while I was thinking through ideas for what the scene would look like, my partner and I took a trip on a local light rail to visit a few neighboring cities. The peaceful ride and scenery struck me as the perfect inspiration for the imagined world, as the setting felt like something that could exist in the child's imagination as a blend of real-world memory and stylized reinterpretation. When choosing a style, I wanted something warm and imaginative, something that supported the theme of a child's mind shaping the world. With that in mind, I looked at several different options, such as watercolor, hand-drawn, and cel-shaded, but ultimately, I settled on a Ghibli-esque look. Now, to be clear, while I'm aiming for the Ghibli feel, I know that there are going to be differences. First of all, my game is in 3D, and that alone creates a different visual language. On top of that, I don't expect to master all the intricacies of that style within the time frame that I'm working in, so I'm not trying to perfectly replicate it. Rather, I hope that this serves as a kind of nod to the aesthetic, an interpretation that captures some of the warmth and whimsy, even if the execution is different. One of the things that helped me settle on this style is that during my research process, I came across a video by Stylized that was covering a Ghibli-style Unreal project. This video became a strong reference point for me during my learning process, and even though it wasn't a tutorial, it gave me just enough framework to follow along, while still leaving me with enough room to experiment and learn for myself. With the style in mind, I jumped into Blender to begin modeling the assets. Most of them were fairly simple, as they were symmetrical, low-poly shapes with beveling, and the modeling phase was actually a refreshing change of pace from coding. Once the modeling was completed, I moved on to something that I had very little experience with: texturing. I opened up Substance Designer and started learning how to create tileable textures. This took longer than expected, but by the end of the week, I had made 9 custom textures for the scene. Then came UV unwrapping, which is when you figure out where to place seams and how to hide them when possible. Definitely not the most exciting part, but it was necessary. One of the things that made me such a fan of the Stylized video was the trees. They have a soft, puffy look, and they feel like something that would live naturally in an imagined world. They captured the look I was going for so perfectly, and with that in mind, I decided I would try to replicate them as closely as I could. Now, to do this, instead of using traditional leaf cards, I made spherical meshes and split the faces into individual billboards. This gives each tree that full, rounded appearance and maintains the cohesive visual style of the scene. That being said, this method does come with cost, and that cost is overdraw. With so many masked faces being rendered, performance takes a hit. To help mitigate that, I added a second, smaller, opaque mesh inside of the foliage volume. Now, that does help reduce the overdraw slightly, but I will need to continue to explore more efficient options moving forward. Originally, I had considered making a custom weather and sky system. This consideration lasted for about 10 minutes until I realized just how complicated that would be. Instead, I ended up using the Stylized Dynamic Sky and Weather system by So Stylized, which I found on the marketplace. It gave me a great foundation, and I could tweak it later to make sure that it fits the overall look of the scene. Once the sky and lighting were in place, I decided that I wanted to flesh out the landscape next. To do this, I used a program called Gaia to sculpt the base landscape. While I'm still learning the tool, I found that it's a great way to get natural looking terrain and have good control over the shapes and elevation. After finalizing the height map in Gaia, I imported it into Unreal Engine to use as my playable landscape. From there, I used Unreal's PCG, or Procedural Content Generation, to start populating the world. PCG allows me to create PCG graphs that handle scattering the trees and other foliage that I built earlier. This helps break up the landscape and make it feel more alive, while also giving me full control to adjust the densities and placement rules later on. The next problem I ran into is that I had to figure out how to stop the grass, trees, and other foliage from overlapping with the man-made structures. To fix this, I had to implement 2 different solutions. For the grass, which is populated using the landscape material, I utilized something called RVTs, or Runtime Virtual Textures, to essentially mask out areas that I didn't want grass to populate. For PCG, I created a custom blueprint that had a box collision and use that collision to generate volumes that would be ignored when it came to placing the trees and other foliage. With most of the scene complete, I wanted to challenge myself again, this time by creating the train itself. And since this train will play a key role in the game's story, and have its own gameplay mechanics, I knew I needed something more polished. This model has to be hollow, riggable, and modular, and it took a few iterations to get the shape right, especially for things like windows and doors. But eventually, I ended up with a version I was happy with. I also built a control console for the interior, since the player will eventually be able to control the train by interacting with it during gameplay. After modeling, I started rigging the train and console, and I was able to get the basic bone structure in place so that in the future I will be able to create the custom animations as needed. Finally, I tackled the logic for getting the train to follow the tracks in-game. To do this, I set up a spline-based track system and a separate blueprint for the train to ensure that it moves along the spline. To make sure the movement looks correct, I have the train aligned to the tracks using the location of each axle rather than the center mass of the train's body. This ensures the train aligns to the track properly when turning or going up an incline. At this point, I had a nearly complete, though admittedly unpolished scene. Unfortunately, the scene ended up leaning on the reference video more than I had initially hoped. But that being said, I think that this project helped me take a huge step forward towards defining the visual identity for the imagined world. I still have some materials that need to be finished, and there's plenty left to refine, especially in terms of the layout and texture quality, but I'm happy with where things are headed. I'm also aware that the train, being a central part of the story, will likely need to be custom painted, and that's something I'll probably commission later since I'm not confident that I could get the quality I want myself. And that wraps up what I've been able to work on this month. If you worked on a stylized project like this, or if you have any thoughts on how to improve on what I've done, I'd love to hear your suggestions in the comments. Thanks for watching.